London, UK, and it's my privilege to say welcome to all of you today and today's human rights event here in Europe House. We talk about human rights basically 365 days a year in the European Parliament, but today is a special day. Today is the day when we acknowledge the Sakharov Prize, and I'm very pleased to see that so many of you wants to share this experience with us today. I want to just mention a few things. I want to say thank you to UCL. Thanks for organizing today's event. And I want to say thank you to the panel. We have a great panel here today. And finally, I would like to mention that the fire exit is up through that door and to the left. And then give the floor to today's moderator, Tim.
Great, thank you. Well, today we're going for a sort of Spartan approach with two kings. So Peter Zuzi, my colleague, will introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thanks. As Tim has just mentioned, my name is Peter Zuzi. I'm a lecturer on Czech and Slovak literature and culture at UCL's School of Slavonic Studies. My colleague Tim Beasley Murray is senior lecturer on European thought and politics. Culture. We're going to be moderating sort of in tandem today. And what I would like to do first of all is I would like to thank the European Parliament office here for hosting us today. I'd also like to thank the European Institute at UCL. And I won't go into names because there's a fairly long list of names of people who contributed to this. What I'm going to do now is introduce our distinguished panel. I'm going to start from this end and sort of move to my left. And the first person I'd like to introduce is His Excellency Michal Žantovský, who is the ambassador of the Czech Republic here to the Court of St. James. He's previously been ambassador to Israel and to the United States. Before that, he was a major politician in Czech Republic. He was a senator. And before that, and of particular interest for us today, in the early 90s, he was a close friend and spokesman for Václav Havel. Next, on my right, is Tom Moriarty, who is a graduate of LSE, where he studied socioeconomic theory. He worked for quite some time as a chief executive of a communications firm here in the city, in London. He's a founder member of the economics working group of the Occupy movement, and he also is a recording artist, so also very pertinent for our combination of interests today. Here on my left is Professor Aliona Ledenova, a colleague of mine and Tim's at UCL, School of Slavonic and East European Studies. She's professor of politics and society there. She's done a lot of work on studying the themes of corruption and informal economics. She's currently working on the concept of sistema, which she recently described to us very nicely as describing how people comply with the system by playing the game of open secrets and knowing smiles. On the end of our table here is Edward Macmillan Scott, who is the Vice President of the European Parliament, currently with the Lib Dems, but for a long time member of the Conservative Party, where he was outspoken for pro-European views. He's also been very active in human rights issues, and in particular in campaigning for reform in China. So as you see, it's a very distinguished and very apt group of speakers today. What I'm going to do now is pass the microphone to Tim, who will say some words about our thinking behind this, this panel, which is not in any way intended to set a formal agenda, but we'll just raise some of the questions that have interested us coming to this event. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Well, why are we here this evening? Well, the answer is quite simple. We're here in connection with the prize that the European Parliament gives out each year, the Sakharov Prize, named after the dissident in the Soviet Union that honors achievements in freedom of thought. And this year's participants this year, the Sakharov Prize was awarded to two Iranians, the filmmaker Jafar Panahi and the lawyer Nasrin Sotoudeh. Who are these people? Well, Panahi is a film director whose films have portrayed the lives of the marginalized, of women and children, people who don't fit into the system. As a result, his films have been construed as social criticism, and since 2010, he's been in various forms of detention now for 6 years, and he's been banned from making films or interviews for 20 years. The latest film was Smuggled Out, that he made, smuggled out of Iran on a data stick baked in a cake. Right? That's Panahi. The other person, Nasrin Sotoudeh, is a lawyer who has worked for abused women, victims of violence, abused children, but also for the cases of various journalists and intellectuals who've fallen foul of the Iranian regime. She also is in prison for 11 years, banned from leaving the country for 20. What we have here then is an alliance of the arts and law, an artist, a filmmaker, and a lawyer, someone doing experimental stuff, someone appealing to norms. And when we look to us thinking about Eastern Europe, this is rather familiar. Because if we look back to the 1970s in Czechoslovakia, we see a similar alliance of creative activity and sense of the legal or the law at work. Why? Well, in 1977, a group of people came together in Czechoslovakia who decided to come and express their dissent, their opposition to the regime. Why did they do that? Well, they did that for two reasons. One, in 1975, Czechoslovakia had signed up to the Helsinki Accords, and they wanted to hold the government to those declarations on human rights that the government had made. That is, they wanted the government to adhere to legal norms. The other reason why they came together was because an underground rock band, the Plastic People of the Universe, had been banned. So on the other hand, they wanted to support the freedom of people to experiment and express creativity, create themselves creatively, arts and the law. And from this group that called itself Charter 77 came a dissident movement out of these twin impulses, law and the arts, that eventually took its part in the overthrow of the regime and the complete transformation of Europe in 1989. Now, in this movement in Charter 77, one of its key figures was Václav Havel, who was a playwright, imprisoned himself for many years, eventually, as you know, president of Czechoslovakia. And in his writing, he formulated what it meant to dissent. Havel argued that dissent was the art of the impossible, the art of not accepting the status quo as the only state of affairs that possible, despite all apparent practices. And in his own life, his own work, he kept that art, he developed that art. Now, what we want to suggest today is that we can understand today's world, today's dissent best. Well, one way of looking at it is to look back at what was done by people like Havel and others 1 year on from Havel's death. He died just after Christmas last year, I think. But just before Christmas, I'm sorry, Ambassador. And to see what legacy Havel's ideas have for dissent today. Because today we see dissent all around the world. We see it in Iran, but also in Putin's Russia, in Charter 08 in China, a model that explicitly modeled itself on a group that explicitly models itself on the Czechoslovak Charter 77. We see it in the upheavals of the Arab Spring, in Belarus, Burma, Bahrain, wherever. Of course, and here, the arts often play an important role, whether it's Pussy Riot that we could argue about, but certainly, say, in China, the towering figure of Ai Weiwei, who has made dissent into an art form and art into a form of dissent. Now, here in Europe, we're perhaps okay with dissent over there, but we're perhaps less good about dissent within Europe. And within Europe, there's an awful lot of dissent going on, whether in the Occupy movement that Tom is here to represent, or the anti-austerity processes in Greece and Spain. And there's a growing realization that given the complete collapse of the economic order and the bankruptcy of our political system, we have to develop some art of the impossible to find solutions. Now, why are we here today again? Well, the European Union doesn't just give out prizes to honour dissidents like Panahi So today it also receives prizes. Recently it's received the Nobel Peace Prize. And perhaps we can be happy with this in some way. Maybe it's all our prize in various ways. But there's a task that remains undone. The EU seems uncomfortable with dissent, as I say, when it happens beyond its borders. But perhaps the lesson of Havel is that our task as Europeans is to resist this sense of comfortableness and to draw on his legacy properly. That is to say, to demand justice and experiment, to be artists and lawyers, if you want, to dare to think and do the impossible. Okay, so that's some of the ways in which we've been framing this, and I guess now we can move on to very different positions. I hope that will come from the rest of this panel that's been so good to come today. Yeah.
Okay, I'll say a few words of how we're going to proceed. We're going to ask all of our panel members first to speak however they wish to the general themes of this conference today. 5 tops 10 minutes. Then what we'll do is sort of take what has come out of that, start to develop a discussion, and then open the discussion up for questions from the audience. I think that perhaps we haven't given any agenda, as I say, for how people should speak to these themes, but overriding questions that obviously will be in the air, as it were, are to just reflect upon what might be deemed a sort of renaissance in dissent in the last several years across the world, but in Europe, in the United States, as well as in places that have sort of overtly repressive regimes. And so I think another question then becomes, in what ways does the idea, sort of model of dissent within what one might call classically repressive regimes, what sort of lessons or experiences might we draw here from those sorts of experiences? Okay, we'll start, if I may ask Ambassador Żądowski to begin. Pass a microphone down.
Well, thank you very much for including me in this wonderful occasion, celebrating some very courageous people in Iran by an award in the name of another very courageous man. I should probably start by saying that Václav Havel was a lifelong admirer of Andrei Sakharov. They never met, obviously, because of political reasons and because they were being isolated or worse in their own countries. And he only came to Russia for the first time in February 1990 as president, already for the first meeting with President Gorbachev, but his first trip led to a cemetery to the grave of Andrei Sakharov. He was there with Yelena Bonner, the widow of Sakharov. So there is a strong affinity here, and just as well, Václav Havel would have admired and wished the best to Nasrin Sotoudeh and Jafar Panahi. One of them is a filmmaker, and Havel wanted to be a filmmaker all his life, and finally he made it a year before his death. He made a film, and the other one is a human rights defender, and Havel was just dead. But we are here to talk about dissent, and one of the important things in Havel's thinking about dissent, and I think it's quite relevant to our discussion here, is that one does not choose to be a dissident. One is thrown by circumstances into being a dissident, by his own sense of identity and integrity. Havel uses the Heideggerian concept of thrownness or fallenness for this situation, but what he means is that he never considered himself to be a professional dissident. He was a writer first and foremost, and in in living as a writer and in doing his work, he became a dissident. It's kind of easy, and many of us have experienced it, to do this in a totalitarian regime. You know, if you're not very careful, before you know you're a dissident. It's somewhat more difficult to do that in an open system which respects and recognizes and tolerates dissent. And I think I agree with Peter that there are all kinds of legitimate protests around us against a number of aspects of our present condition, and I think that some of the protests are, you know, give us a lot of food for thought. I would hesitate to call the protesters dissenters. It's a matter of terminology, but there is a distinction here. What makes in Havel's thinking, I will return to that, a dissident, what he is, are basically three elements that he comes back to and reiterates in most of his writing and in most of his thinking. And at the core of it is an internal, not an external process. It's a process of being true to oneself, of being identical with oneself. And this is one of the topics he elaborates on in The Power of the Powerless, using the example of the grocer who in his shop window exhibits the communist slogan, "Workers of the world unite," without for a minute believing in the slogan, and more interestingly, without the authorities expecting or requiring to believe in it. To demonstrate that the totalitarian system operates primarily by pressuring people to divest themselves of their innermost identity through such and similar rituals. The mechanism through which the system exerts its power hinges only on the greengrocer's willingness not to withhold his ritual approval, not to display the slogan. And Havel writes, individuals can be alienated from themselves only because there is something in them to alienate. Living the truth is thus woven directly into the texture of living a lie. It is the repressed alternative. And this is what protest and dissent does. It frees the repressed alternative and becomes one with it, becomes a part of the identity. The other element, the second element that Havel dwells on is the element of responsibility. One cannot truly be identical with oneself, renew sovereignty over one's own affairs, as he puts it, without accepting responsibility for it, and something which is not entirely self-evident in today's orgies of victim. Our actions are always illuminated by responsibility, he writes. And by implication, this also means sharing the responsibility for the affairs of one's family, one's community, one's society, and eventually for global affairs as well. Freedom without responsibility is nothing but reckless self-indulgence and a search for excuses to blame others for our own faults. Responsibility is another part of the price we pay for our freedom. And the last concept which is intrinsic to Havel is the concept of morality, and he's been sometimes criticized for that as a moralizer, not just a moralist, but that, for better or worse, is what he was. And again, the concept of responsibility is meaningless without a system of moral values, because if there is no moral balance to one's own actions, there is nothing to take responsibility for. In Letters to Olga, Havel examines the roots of moral thinking, again using a practical example of a man alone late at night in an empty tram who chooses to validate his ticket, although there is no one else present to reproach him if he does not. And he comes to the conclusion that the man's behavior is impossible to explain without a metaphysical horizon. Objectively, you shouldn't care one way or another whether the Transport Commission gets paid for the ticket or not. But, Havel writes, but I do care because I'm convinced that my existence, like everything that has ever happened, has ruffled the surface of being, and that after my little ripple, however marginal, insignificant, and ephemeral it may have been, being is and always will be different from what it was before. All my life I have simply believed that what is once done can never be undone, and that in fact everything remains forever. In short, being has a memory, and the concept of a memory of being is central to Havel. And now how do these, this will be my last remark, how do these three elements come together? I think he best exposed this or explicated this in actually a political speech in the address to the joint session of the US Congress in February 1990, which considering what he said was a very strange place to express it. And he told the congressmen and the senators, all 535 of them, the following. The salvation of this human world lies nowhere else than in the human heart, in the human power to reflect, in human humbleness, and in human responsibility. Without a global revolution in the sphere of human consciousness, nothing will change for the better in the sphere of our being as humans, and the catastrophe toward which this world is headed, whether it be ecological, social, demographic, or a general breakdown of civilization, will be unavoidable. We are still a long way from that family of man. In fact, we seem to be receding from the ideal rather than drawing closer to it. Interests of all kinds, personal, selfish, state, national group, and corporate interests still considerably outweigh genuinely common and global interests. We are still under the sway of the destructive and sorrowfully vain belief that man is the pinnacle of creation and not just a part of it, and that therefore everything is permitted. We are still destroying the planet that was entrusted to us and its environment. We still close our eyes to the growing social, ethnic, and cultural conflicts in the world. In other words, we still don't know how to put morality ahead of politics, science, and economics. We are still incapable of understanding that the only genuine backbone of all our actions, if they are to be moral, is responsibility. Responsibility to something higher than my family, my country, my firm, my success. Responsibility to the order of being, where all our actions are indelibly recorded, and where and only where they will be properly judged. And I think I will stop on this.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Many thoughts there for us to come back to, and I'm very glad you also brought the words of Havel in here. I would add, I think Havel is probably the only person who, in addressing the joint session of Congress, has ever alluded to Heidegger, which is symptomatic of the sorts of things we're talking about here. Okay.
Can I just come in and say something Gergely asked me to point to, is that we are experimenting in forms of dialogue and forms of participation, particularly in the form with this Twitter wall. I'd like to point you to the hashtag, I don't quite understand this, but hashtag Sakharov Debate, and you're encouraged with your various devices to contribute to the debate there and to put your thoughts up there, and indeed your questions you wish to put to the panel or wish to be raised, okay? So that is, as I say, our experimental form of open source something, right?
Okay. We're not going to go straight across the table. I hope that's not too confusing, but I'm going to ask Aliona to speak next, then we'll have Tom, then we'll have Edward, so it'll be a crisscrossing. So
Right. Thank you very much. I just wanted to mention very briefly, it is 5 minutes, isn't it?
yeah.
That I was lucky to be born in Academy Town, which is a small place in Siberia called Akademgorodok, where the famous nuclear accelerator was hidden in the middle of the forest. And the head of the Institute of Nuclear Physics was Andrei Sakharov, who was a close friend or colleague of Andrei Sakharov. And of course, the interesting situation about my place was that we had a liberal KGB. And Sakharov shared Sakharov's views. And effectively, he was the only director of strategically important nuclear institute who was not a Communist Party member. He was a live example that one could actually push the boundaries of the system. But it was only possible in a very select environment, in the forest, in the middle of nowhere, where no foreigner could reach without special guidance of a KGB officer. However, that kind of system produced a very different form of dissent. And I remember when we shared samizdat materials, you know, we never were threatened with criminal record, which my colleagues from St. Petersburg, for example, were threatened straight away for the same action. They could get 2 years, you know, criminal record just for giving a book retyped at their home. So that kind of a background showed to me very powerfully that dissent cannot actually be viewed outside of the context of the system in which it emerges. It's kind of should be defined as dissent from what? And that was my research question for many years, because a lot of people who come from background like myself, they think, oh, the system made me. It shaped me the way I am. It made me be immoral. And of course, immoral systems, oppressive systems, they shape people differently. And just wanted to give you a short memoir, piece from memoirs by Joseph Brodsky, who was a dissent of a kind as well. And he said about the system that if one had brains, one would certainly try to outsmart the system by devising all kind of detours, arranging shady deals with one's supervisors, piling up lies and pulling the strings of one's semi-nepotistic connections. This would become a full-time job. One was constantly aware that the web one had woven was a web of lies, and in spite of the degree of success or your sense of humor, indeed, you despise yourself. And that was the ultimate triumph of the system. Whether you beat it or you join it, you feel equally guilty. The national belief is, as the proverb has it, that there is no evil without a grain of good in it, and presumably vice versa. Ambivalence, I think, Joseph Brodsky thinks, is a chief characteristic of my nation. And that is an interesting thing about the dissent. And, you know, if you see that Twitter on the top, you know, why can't one be in two places at once? Well, that's effectively what the system achieved in Soviet Russia, that people were able to think two things at once. And that created the phenomenon of doublethink, the double standards, and that fundamental immorality that made people who dissented from it, who were able to push the system to reveal its true face, moralists. And I think that's very important nature of the dissent, because it's really not about confronting power or trying to get power. It's just pure value-oriented action. And I think it's essentially which defines the dissent and also differs from the opposition, which could emerge in any system. And the last point I wanted to say, to mention about this system, is that the oppressive systems are particularly interesting because they are really stimulating a certain kind of creativity, a response that is impossible to achieve in a liberal environment. And that kind of creative power of rigid constraint is something that is linked to marginality, linked to the nature of our responses, which is best described by another writer, Fazil Iskander, who describes living with the Soviet system as sharing a cell with a madman and playing chess with this person. So you can't really win, because then the madman gets mad and hurt you. But you can't really lose, because then he will realize you are losing for a purpose, therefore he'll get mad and hurt you. So you have to find a creative way, and that is pretty much associated with reading between the lines. using all kind of ambivalences, using pauses, silences, themes topic, in order to be able to communicate. And that's the legacy which is very interesting. I think it's no surprise that Iranian movies are so moving and special, because they live under a very oppressive system indeed. And I'll stop here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Elena. I mean, what's interesting is that we're from this Soviet experience, in one sense, you're describing, and also from what Ambassador Jantovsky said, we have something similar here about the role of authenticity but also doublethink as a productive thing in dissent. And also, we've had very clearly the notion that dissent perhaps is about some sort of moral position. But there's a danger there that by becoming about right and wrong, not right and left, it loses its political power. And I think that's a problematic aspect to dissent, that, as the Ambassador also pointed to, criticisms of Havel. Maybe we can move now to Tom, who is, has perhaps a different approach to the practice of dissent.
Maybe slightly different. I guess it's probably worth me just putting things into perspective in terms of how I got into Occupy, because apart from anything else, it sort of keys in a lot with what Havel has said, and also what you were saying, Ambassador, in terms of it being, to a certain extent, a personal journey. Having had some grounding in economics at the LSE, and then having worked into the city, I was working there for 14 years, and then 10 years running my own company, which I started in 1999. By the time 2005, 2006 came around, I found myself in a very interesting position on the basis that I was looking after companies that were involved in providing technology for trading. I was working with companies that were themselves being traded. And when you're on the inside like that, you start to notice things are starting to go wrong. You start to notice that actually, if it carries on like this, there is going to be an almighty fall coming around the corner. And whilst in the city there is the age-old adage of make hay whilst the sun is shining, clearly that can only last so long. And I had worked through the dot-com boom and bust before, and obviously in previous, before the city had been around, when we were going through previous recessions. So it's quite clear to me that it was unsustainable, not only what was going on in the city, but various other aspects of the economic system. And quite frankly, I got to the point where I couldn't take it anymore. And I chose to leave. I chose to protest in a way that I protest, being a singer and a musician, and that is to write music about it, and that's what I did. When you're looking at the world, and it seems that not very many people can see that there is something about to happen that is going to negatively affect everyone's lives, you tend to want to say something about it. You don't want to be the person just watching the car crash about to happen. And there's a very good reason, I guess, why I called the album that I wrote Fire in the Doll's House. So that's really what, that was my calling. Which brings us on really to how I joined Occupy, and actually the reason why so many others did. I should just read one thing from Havel, and some of you may be familiar with the independent life of society, but I'll quickly put it in context. The point where living within the truth ceases to be a mere negation of living with a lie and becomes articulate in a particular way is the point at which something is born that might be called the independent spiritual, social, and political life of society. He goes on, what is this independent life of society? The spectrum of its expressions and activities is naturally very wide and includes everything from self-education and thinking about the world through creative activity and its communication to others, to the most varied free civic attitudes, including instances of independent social self-organization, which is a very good example of Occupy. In short, it is an area in which living within the truth becomes articulate and materializes in a visible way. Now, I would argue actually that a lot of this was materializing in a visible way before Occupy emerged. But clearly, something happens to break the camel's back, namely a global financial crisis that makes pretty much most people in the Western world's lives a lot harder. And that certainly spurs people to emerge from the life of the independent life of society to become protesters. It's interesting. The word dissident is a cool word. Of course, you know, there's a romantic deal associated with being a dissident or a dissenter, and it has to be said that I wouldn't say that people in Occupy would label themselves as that. This tends to come as a label applied by those that don't like protesters. It has negative connotations, and certainly when we came together, we spent a lot of time being certainly harassed, negated in the press, being labeled as anarchists, socialists, any ists, anything but pragmatist, which actually is what a lot of what we talk about is about. It was interesting what you were saying there about left or right. We tend, although obviously we are a very broad church, there's no admission policy and anyone can come in and we do have very broad views, but the sum total of what we are talking about are the sorts of changes that we expect will have to happen no matter what colour of the next government here or there or wherever. These are fundamental changes driven by some very basic dynamics in the global economy, namely things like population growth, limited resources, and diminishing resources, and of course environmental change. So we feel that it's almost undeniable that these things have to change, and we're not going to sit down until we start making them happen. People have often asked us, have you made a difference? And of course some people would say it's this is utopia, you're imagining, you're idealists, etc., etc. But one thing I would say is I don't believe that. In fact, I would argue that the path of the mainstream of society and humanity is a function of all the vectors that are applied to it. I'm sure some of you would be familiar with the physics of that. And namely that if we are just one small vector applied to the mainstream, that means that it is diverted slightly from there to there. That might be all the difference that it takes to avoid hitting what we see as an iceberg out there in the mist. We have our truth, and the truth is related to we feel we can see that. And a lot of what we are about is actually just alerting people to what we are seeing. It's up to people. They can take it or leave it, but we will provide what we know to be our truth. And that is the way we operate. So a lot of what we're actually about is asking the question and providing information and ideas into society so that other people also start asking that question. And what's interesting about it is people say, well, why don't you have a manifesto? And we're a movement of the people. Surely, if we are a movement of the people, manifesto or behavioural change, if we can call it that, is not given to people or meted out to people. It is about providing information to the people and behavioural change coming from that. Just to finish, I would say, in that sense, there is certainly a phenomenon happening anyway, whether Occupy is responsible or in part or even slightly responsible is open to question, I'm sure. But the fact is that we are seeing behavioural change. We are seeing, for example, a reaction at the local or community level to the operations of Starbucks. We know that transitional towns in the southwest, such as Totnes, won't have a Costa because they want to keep the local currency or the local wealth within that community. We're seeing people buying wood burners in a way of isolating themselves from cartel-like behaviour of the 6 energy companies. There are all these things going on. So I would argue that not only is it likely to continue to change in the face of these dynamics, it's already happening. And it's already happening at a government level as well. We start to see nation states seizing back assets of national importance. We've seen it in Argentina, taking back some assets of Repsol. We've seen it in Ecuador, seizing the national grid. We've seen it with Putin, trying to obviously recover control of oil. So it's definitely happening. Occupy is here, I would say, pushing for that sort of change and making sure that eyes are open to what is likely to happen if we don't be proactive in how we deal with the challenges of the 21st century. The only other thing I'd say is that, you know, one, we can talk about the art of the impossible. I would probably argue that most people in Occupy see it as the art of the possible.
Thank you, Tom. Very interesting remarks. I like what you were talking about pragmatism there, because I think that that's something that oftentimes one loses sight of when thinking about protest movements. One thinks of them as idealist, utopian, head in the clouds. But that idea that you're talking about a pragmatic impulse is very interesting, and sort of comes to, or could be made to play along with a quotation from the philosopher Slavoj Žižek, based here in London, who said at one point, "Be reasonable, demand the impossible." One might say that that's sort of behind some of what you were saying. Finally, I'd like to ask Edward Macmillan Scott to offer some words.
Well, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Peter. Well, you provided an extremely intellectual framework for this discussion, and which is a bit of a challenge for me. I should explain. I used to come to this building very frequently when I was a member of the Tory party. I was a Tory MEP for 25 years, and rather happily, the European Commission and the European Parliament decided to take over the building when the Conservative Central Office closed. And the words intellectual and Tory are a contradiction in terms, what you academics would call an oxymoron. But as I'm a Vice President of the European Parliament, and next Wednesday we will be awarding the Sakharov Prize to these two winners. This is the reason for the debate. And in order to focus on the issues thrown up by the name of Sakharov, his extraordinary open letter in 1968, which really kicked off the dissident movement in the then Soviet Union, and so many other figures who've been mentioned this evening, I'd just like to begin by saying that, in my view, politics is the art of the possible is a slightly errant term. I've always turned it round to say politics is the art of the probable. In other words, politicians should try and anticipate events, know what's coming down the track, and at its most basic, when you see a bandwagon running, jump onto it. And so I think that characteristic of politicians is quite important. What was interesting about the dissidents, and I've been fortunate enough over the 27 years I've been in the European Parliament, always working on human rights and democracy, is to meet so many of the people who are celebrated in this prize, not just the prize winners, but also people like Yelena Bonner, who was the widow of Sakharov, who sadly died in June 2011, herself, an extremely vivid personality, an extremely active rebel against the Soviet system, who always said to me and others, look, don't just talk about Andrei, I was there too, and although she cherished his memory, she was a redoubtable character, and I was very fond of her, and very sad she died. The Sakharov Prize over the years has been awarded to people like Osvaldo Paya in Cuba, to the Madres de Blanco, the Mothers in White, who are perpetually commemorating by their actions their menfolk, because it is men, who still remain in prison by and large in Cuba. We think of, obviously, Václav Havel himself, who I have had the fortune to meet on occasions. We worked together on democracy, because that was his latter passion, incidentally, in Cuba. He was deeply concerned about it. And Nelson Mandela, a towering figure in the extraordinary changes that took place in South Africa. So it is important to recognize the spirit that moved all these people, whether it was the sense of seeking democracy or the rule of law or other fundamental freedoms. There was some spirit which drove them. And fortunately, some of them, like Havel himself, were artists. To me, however, what we might just do, and since we've just heard from Tom, who is a contemporary activist in a very fascinating movement, and I have a researcher who actually does look at some of these movements going on around the world, including Occupy, is where the Sakharov Prize of 2012 will inspire other people to look at just what happened in the past. And I'd like to think about, briefly, two world movements. One is China. And I had the fortune to meet Ai Weiwei, who is the brilliant artist who was in the Tate Modern in 2011 with his extraordinary sunflower seeds exhibit. And I didn't know he'd be there, but I went, of course, hoping he might be. And I met Ai Weiwei, and he was the designer, or part designer, of the bird's nest in Beijing for the Beijing Olympics, but he refused to attend the Olympics because he said, quotes, "the regime is disgusting." Now that's not easy to say for a public figure in China today, but he said it. And he's made, as Tom said at the beginning, using my phrase actually, Ai Weiwei has turned art into a form of dissent. Because after the exhibition opened at Tate Modern, I went up to and said, you know, we were talking about a mutual friend of ours who actually is still in prison in China after 4 years, a human rights lawyer called Gao Shisheng, an extremely distinguished man. And Ai Weiwei said to me, in a civilized country, such an imprisonment would be, quote, impossible, to use the word of the evening. And he said, he went on to say actually, and this is a relevant point to Occupy and other movements, that the young people in China today will not accept the continuation of this process. And he explained about their various social media and so on, and the sense that things were happening. And remember, this was 2 months before Tunisia, and 3 months before Egypt kicked off. And he said, things are moving in China, and they were. So I said to him, would you mind if I just tape your remarks on my iPhone, and I'll post them on YouTube? And he said, of course. And he said, again, it would be impossible in a civilized country to have an imprisonment of this type. And you can still see it. It's a very bad video, incidentally. But nevertheless, he was there and he was saying it. That is the sort of combination of art and dissent, which I think is so vivid to people, certainly in China. So that's one movement that's taking place. And the same year I went to the Nobel ceremony for the award of the Nobel Prize to Liu Xiaobo. Another intellectual, a mention was made of Charter 08. Liu Xiaobo was the author of Charter 08. He signed up 3,000 people across China, very courageous people, because when they signed up to it, they immediately put themselves under house surveillance, and many of them are now in prison, as indeed is Liu Xiaobo. So as we think about Havel, as we think about Sakharov, as we think about all these distinguished people, think too of Liu Xiaobo, who cannot receive his Nobel Peace Prize. The other area I wanted briefly to mention, since I spent a lot of time in the Arab world, and I was, in fact, the first politician to get to Cairo the day after Mubarak fell, is this extraordinary movement that's taking place in that region too. Because the prize was awarded, the Sakharov Prize last year, my suggestion, was awarded to Mohammed Bouazizi, who is the Tunisian who self-immolated, like the 100 Tibetan monks who've so far done it in 2 years, self-immolated against the regime in Tunisia. And he kicked off, he was actually number 19 in Tunisia, but he, for some reason, triggered a public response, and thank God he did. And the Sakharov Prize was awarded to him and to Asma Mahfouz, who's a blogger in Egypt, and other activists, because the movement in the Arab world reflects something which I like to just remark on. I've always felt, I have no religious feelings at all, but I have one religious sense, which is the perfectibility of man. I think wherever you go in the world, whether it's Cuba or China or Egypt, or the Soviet Union, or the Czech Republic, or as it was Czechoslovakia in the time of Havel and Kafka and Milan Kundera, people have the same instinct for freedom, democracy, the sense of family, and the suppression of these natural feelings was, I think, one of the greatest disasters of the last century. I hope that that sense of freedom, the sense of freedom of expression and thought, will be the spirit which will be brought forward by the award of the prize next week. So when, as we conclude this round of interventions, can I just quote another Czech? This is my favorite quote. It's not long. This is Milan Kundera in the allowed for forgetting. Quotes, people are always shouting they want to create a better future. It's not true. The future is an apathetic void of no interest to anyone. The past is full of life, eager to irritate us, provoke and insult us, tempt us to destroy or repaint it. The only reason people want to be the masters of the future is to change the past. Well, it's a cynical thought, but it may be right. Thank you.